So let's go back in time a little bit. Like you said you've been using Linux for a really long time. So how did you get involved in Linux just in the first place, and what sort of brought you to it?
This is going to be a funny, terrible story.
Okay.
You're these days, even always, your family has ever said, "Hey, don't go talking to strangers and things like that."
Right.
Uh, I went into a stranger's house, and okay, so let
Okay.
me let me start.
Right. Right.
I
Okay.
was I was maybe 13, 14 years old. I
Okay.
was riding my bike down the street,
Uh-huh.
and my one of the neighbors on the street had this big pile of junk that they were throwing out. So I, being 13, 14-year-old, I immediately saw some computer stuff in there. So I started digging through their computer stores, like, oh, what do they have here? Is there anything I can change? At that point, my computer was it was a Pentium 1 75 megahertz computer. And yeah.
I was gonna say, do you want to age yourself?
Well, that was the first one that I had of my own. The one before that my family owned was a Wang i386,
I.
but I didn't know too much about that one. I didn't really start getting into it until I got the Pentium one of my own.
Mhm.
But anyway, so this neighbor had these computer parts, and I started digging into them, trying to see what I can salvage. And the neighbor came out, and he came out and he's like, asked me, he's like, "Hey, do you like computers?" Because
Mhm.
he noticed what I was digging in. And I was like, "Yeah, I was just sorry, I didn't mean to bother you. I was just trying to figure out if there was anything that you were throwing out that I might be able to use." And he goes, he's like, "Have you ever heard?" And that's when he popped the question, "Have you ever heard of Linux?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, and he was a younger dude. He was pretty chill. He had a couple people hanging out or whatnot. It wasn't. He seemed like he was safe in my 13-year-old brain for whatever
Right.
reason.
Right.
And he's like, "Hey, do you want to come see something?" And I was like, "Sure. What's danger? Let's go inside this stranger's house." So I went in there, and he brought me over to his computer, and he showed me his computer that at that point was running. I think it had to be either Debian or Mandrake, one of the
Okay.
two at the very beginning. But he showed it to me, and of course, he had like the Matrix screensaver and stuff on there at the time, and I just thought it was so freaking cool. And I was just like, "Oh, what is this? It's so cool!" He showed me all the different customized window management stuff and theming, and what was it called at the time where you could like zoom out the entire desktop into a cube.
Um.
This
Compass.
V it was Fusion something. I
Oh.
don't. It was really old.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm.
But
Yeah. I'm
anyway,
not sure.
he was showing me that stuff, and I just thought it was so freaking cool. And he's just like, "Yeah, this is Linux. You should check it out." And I think it was Debian, because
Okay.
that's kind of what I remember. That was the kind of also the first distro that I like really really dug into on my own. But at that point, after that, I went home, and I was hooked at that point, because I was at that point I was 13, 14 years old, but I was already making like Alta Vista web pages and stuff like that, and like my own blogs and things like that. All the little 14, 13, 14-year old nerdy things at that time. And so I remember maybe like it piqued my interest. I kept using Windows at that point for a little bit longer, but I remember Debian in the back of my head. And then at one point, I remember I had gotten an NVIDIA card, and I decided I was going to install Debian and try to get this NVIDIA card working on Debian at that time. And keep in mind, this
Okay.
was early 2000s, and NVIDIA drivers were shit, let alone trying to get them working on Debian.
Right. Right.
I must have spent like, I don't know, maybe like 2, 3, 4 days on that thing, but I did get it working. I eventually did get it working, and once I got it working, I was like, "This is the coolest shit ever," and I was hooked since then. Obviously, after I got it working, the thrill was gone. It was done. I was like, "Great, this is awesome. I got it working. What do I do now? I can't run any games. Let's reinstall Windows." That was 14-year-old me. But that was
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
first dash in Linux. A couple years later, I got some Mandrake Linux discs. I remember I had asked for them for a gift, and I got them, and I dug into Linux a little bit more at the time, but again, it didn't stick.
Mhm.
And it really didn't stick until like my early to mid 20s when I started working for doing web design, because at that point I wasn't gaming. I was mainly just doing dev work. And that's how I learned the basic LAMP stack, and how I learned PHP
Mhm.
and basic HTML and CSS and Java and JavaScript. Well, JavaScript for the web-based stuff. I didn't really get into Java later on until the Twitch stuff, because I started streaming on Twitch, and I
Mhm.
wanted my own Twitch chatbot.
Okay.
And that was a previous existing bot that I had found that was kind of like rusty. It needed some work, and we started fixing it up. It was me and a couple of guys at that time, but that was all Java. It was all Java based, and that part of the reason that we kept it all Java based is that we wanted it to be cross-platform so that
Mhm.
it ran on Linux, and that's kind of what got me to like slowly but surely stick on Linux. Yeah, and then at that point, I just had a love-hate relationship between Windows and Linux, because I wanted to game,
Mhm.
and Windows was hit or miss with the games. And then I also wanted to use Linux for all my dev stuff. And ultimately, I ended up just fully switching. And now I do what I do now, which is get those games running on Linux if I can.
So is that part of the like just throwing yourself headfirst into Linux? Is that like part of the reason why you're
Danger in a
interested?
stranger's house, throwing myself
Well,
headfirst into that.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
sure.
guess that also adds up, doesn't it? But, like, is that part of the reason why you got interested in trying to get like Wine working better,
Yeah.
and now you're doing Proton GE?
Yeah. It's just you dive in head first. The things that I've learned is dive in head first. If you don't immediately make progress, don't just give up.
Mhm.
If you're going to distro hop to find something that you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
But if you find something that you're comfortable with and you hit another problem, at that point I say don't distro hop. Instead, try digging into the problem to figure out what's wrong. Because once you get to that point and you can slowly but surely start figuring out what's wrong on that one distro that you like,
Mhm.
you can then later on apply that elsewhere to other components, whether it's on the same distro or on a different distro. And it helps a lot to kind of get comfortable with Linux in general,
Mhm.
rather than I get new people all the time that come in and they're just like, oh, I've tried like 4 different distros, I can't get this thing to work. It's like, well, under the hood they're kind of sort of all the same thing. Maybe
Yeah.
you should look under the hood, or at least try. And what's the point if it's already broken? How worse can you make it? Especially, or how much worse can you make it? Especially if you're just going to consider reinstalling anyway.
Mhm.
You might as well just try and fix it if you can.